Connor never expected that opening his door would change everything. For years, he had lived alone, tucked away in his remote mountain cabin, with no one to care for and nothing to protect, until they appeared. A wounded Mustang Mare, barely able to stand, and a fragile foal, shivering violently in the freezing snow. They were on the brink of death, with nowhere else to turn. Connor faced a choice: shut the door or let them in. But the moment he stepped aside, he had no idea that danger was trailing right behind them. And now, he found himself in the fight of his life. The wind howled outside as Connor stood by the window, staring out at the endless white landscape stretching beyond his cabin. The sun hung low in the sky, offering little warmth against the brutal winter cold of the Rocky Mountains. The isolation had become second nature to him. He had chosen it. For the past 5 years, this cabin had been his refuge, a place where silence buried the memories of his past. But today something felt different. Then he heard it, a faint scraping against the wooden door. Connor frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors. No one ever came this far into the mountains. His grip instinctively tightened around the rifle leaning against the wall. Just in case. The noise came again, softer this time, desperate. His pulse quickened as he moved toward the door, hesitating for a brief moment before pulling it open. The freezing air rushed in, misting his breath, and what he saw made his chest tighten. A horse. No, two. A wounded Mustang Mare trembled in the snow, her flanks slick with melting frost, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her legs barely supported her weight, and beside her, pressed close for warmth, stood a tiny foal. Connor's stomach clenched. The foal, later named Rio, could hardly stay upright. His thin legs wobbled, his small head drooped, and his frail body shuddered uncontrollably from the cold. They were freezing to death. Connor knew better than to get involved. He had spent the last 5 years keeping his distance from anything that could make him care. But as he locked eyes with the mare, Salana, as he would later call her, he saw something that made his resolve falter. She wasn't just standing there. She was asking for help. A sharp pang shot through his chest. How had she ended up here? Wild Mustangs didn't just wander into human territory, especially not injured ones with foals. Something had driven her to his door, and judging by her condition, she had nowhere else to turn. Connor's jaw tightened. Every instinct told him to walk away. But then Rio let out a weak, pitiful sound, barely a whimper. His tiny body swayed, and that was all it took. Connor made his decision. He stepped aside. He let them in. The moment they entered, the cabin's warmth hit them. Rio collapsed onto the wooden floor, his frail legs unable to hold him up any longer. Connor moved quickly, grabbing old blankets from the couch and carefully draping them over the foal's small frame. Salana stood still, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Her dark eyes remained locked onto Connor, wary, uncertain if she had made the right choice. Crouching beside Rio, Connor pressed a gentle hand against his damp coat. Too cold. His breathing was too shallow, his heartbeat too slow. Connor swore under his breath. If he didn't act fast, Rio wouldn't make it. He grabbed the kettle by the fire and carefully poured warm water into a small tin bowl, pushing it toward Salana. But she didn't drink. She only watched, still testing him. Connor sighed. He needed her trust, because now that he had let them in, he wasn't going to let them die. Even with the blankets and the fire, Rio's tiny body remained too cold. His breathing was too faint. The foal needed real heat and fast. Connor stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace and grabbing more firewood. The flames flickered higher, but even that wasn't enough. He turned to Salana. She stood near the door, her body tense, ears flicking at every movement he made. She was still unsure, still watching him as if he were a predator waiting to strike. But she wasn't leaving. That meant something. Connor crouched beside Rio, gently tucking the blankets tighter around him. The foal twitched slightly, but his body remained stiff, his muscles weak from the cold. "Come on, kid. Stay with me." Connor knew what he had to do, but Salana wouldn't like it. Wild horses didn't trust easily. If he even attempted to move Rio closer to the fire, she might panic. She might fight him. And if that happened, she could hurt herself, or worse, hurt Rio. Connor needed her trust. Slowly, carefully, he reached out, not toward Rio, but toward Salana. She tensed immediately, nostrils flaring. For a moment, he thought she might rear up, but she didn't. She only watched, testing him. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "I'm not going to hurt him, but I need to help him." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Careful, calm, non-threatening. Connor moved an inch closer. Salana remained still. That was all the permission he needed. With measured movements, he slid his arms beneath Rio's fragile body and gently lifted him. The foal's small heart beat weakly against his chest. Salana stomped a hoof. Connor froze. For a breathless second, he thought she would charge. But she didn't. She only watched, her muscles tight, but not aggressive. She was letting him do this. Exhaling slowly, Connor carried Rio toward the fire, ensuring every move was deliberate, careful. He wasn't just fighting to keep the foal alive. He was fighting to earn her trust. Connor carefully laid the foal down on the thickest rug, pulling the blankets back over him with precision. Salana followed his every move, her steps cautious. She lowered her head, nudging Rio's side gently, as if reassuring herself that he was still there. Connor stepped back, giving her space. This was her baby, and he wouldn't interfere more than necessary. After a few tense seconds, Salana relaxed slightly. That's when Connor noticed it. Her legs were trembling. She wasn't just exhausted. She was injured. His eyes dropped to her front leg, where a deep cut ran along the side of her fetlock. The wound was crusted with dried blood and dirt, a clear sign that she had been running hard on it. No wonder she was so weak. She had pushed herself past her limit, and she had done it for Rio. The realization tightened Connor's chest. She could have collapsed out in the snow, could have given up, but she hadn't. She had kept going against all odds, and somehow she had made it to him. His hands clenched into fists. Salana and Rio needed more than just heat. They needed medical care, real food, things he didn't have on hand. That meant he had to get supplies, but leaving them alone wasn't an option. Not yet. Connor sat back on his heels, watching the wild mare and her fragile foal. He had spent the last 5 years keeping people and responsibilities out of his life. And yet, here he was, caring about 2 creatures he had never even met before today. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. What the hell had he just gotten himself into? Miles away, Tucker Barnes leaned against the hood of his truck, studying the faint hoof prints in the snow. They led straight toward the mountains, straight toward someone's cabin. His jaw tightened. He was close, and when he found that Mustang, he wasn't leaving without her. The fire crackled, filling the cabin with warmth, but Connor remained uneasy. Salana stood near the fireplace, her head lowered, legs still trembling as she watched over Rio. The foal's breathing had steadied, but he was far from recovered, barely stirring beneath the thick blankets. Connor rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. They wouldn't last without food. He had nothing suitable for a young foal. Rio needed milk, and Salana needed real nourishment. Scraps and oats wouldn't cut it. That meant he had to go to town, and that was a problem. He didn't want to leave them. Salana still didn't trust him completely, and if she panicked while he was gone, she might hurt herself. Or worse, she might hurt Rio. But if he stayed, they might not make it through another freezing night. Damn it. Connor pushed himself up from the floor, rolling his stiff shoulders. There was no other choice. He had to make this quick. Moving toward the back room, he grabbed his heavy coat and gloves. Salana tensed immediately. Her sharp, wary eyes followed his every movement, ears flicking back. "I'll be back," Connor muttered, knowing full well she wouldn't understand. She didn't move. He pulled on his boots and stepped toward the door. His truck was parked a few hundred yards down the path. If he hurried, he could make it to town and back in an hour. But the moment he opened the door, a gust of freezing wind tore through the cabin. Salana reacted instantly. She reared slightly, shifting protectively toward Rio, nostrils flaring. The sudden movement sent a fresh trickle of blood down her injured leg. Connor cursed and quickly shut the door. The wind had startled her, but it was more than that. She thought he was leaving for good. "Like hell I am." Connor sighed, stepping back. "I'm coming back. But if you keep bleeding like that, you won't make it long enough to care." He moved carefully, kneeling near Solana's injured leg. She stiffened but didn't lash out. That was progress. Reaching for a clean rag from a nearby shelf, Connor slowly extended his hand. He didn't dare touch her yet. This had to be her choice. For a long moment, Salana stared him down. Then, finally, she shifted slightly, just enough for him to reach her wound. Connor let out a slow breath. She was letting him help. Working quickly, he cleaned the deep cut, wrapping it tightly with a strip of cloth. She twitched, but didn't pull away. "Good girl," he murmured. When he was done, he stepped back, watching her reaction. She tested her weight on the leg, unsteady, but better. Connor reached for his coat again. "Now I can go." This time, she didn't panic. Maybe she was starting to believe him. A few miles away, Tucker Barnes pulled his truck onto a dirt road, slowing as he studied the untouched snow. Fresh tracks. His Mustang had run this way. A smirk tugged at his lips. She hadn't gotten far, and whoever had her was about to have a problem. The drive into town wasn't long, but Connor couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. Salana and Rio were still inside the cabin alone. The mare had started to trust him, just barely, but if anything startled her while he was gone, she might panic. And if she panicked, she could destroy everything. Rio had gotten too cold again. Connor gritted his teeth, pressing harder on the gas. He wasn't the type to second-guess himself, but something about this felt wrong, like an unseen danger lurked just beyond his reach. He forced himself to focus. Get in, get supplies, get back. Laramie wasn't much, just a handful of stores, a feed supply shop, and locals who minded their own business. That's why Connor liked it. He pulled up outside Hayes General Store, an old feed and goods shop run by a man who had known his father years ago. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The familiar scent of sawdust and leather filled the air. Behind the counter, Jesse Carter looked up from his newspaper, raising a brow. "Well, I'll be damned. Thought you disappeared for good." Connor didn't waste time. Milk replacer. Bandages. Jesse leaned back, eyeing him. "You got an animal that needs tending?" Connor didn't answer. Jesse sighed, rubbing his chin. "All right. Got some in the back. Hold tight." As Jesse disappeared behind the shelves, Connor grabbed a few more supplies, extra blankets, antiseptic, oats. His gut told him to stock up. Just as he reached for another roll of bandages, the bell jingled again. Footsteps. Connor didn't turn, but he felt it. A shift in the air, a presence that didn't belong. His gaze flicked to the reflection in the glass refrigerator door. A man had entered, rugged, built like a ranch hand, but with the eyes of a predator. His boots creaked against the wooden floor as he moved with purpose. Connor knew the type. A man, looking for something, or someone. The stranger stopped near the counter. His voice was low, gravelly. "I'm looking for a horse." Connor's fingers curled around the bandages. Jesse reappeared, frowning. This a missing ranch horse? No, the man exhaled sharply, irritated. Wild Mustang. A mare. Had a foal with her. Connor's heartbeat steadied. Jesse scratched his head. Can't say I've seen any wild horses this close to town. The man didn't look convinced. His sharp gaze swept the store, pausing briefly on Connor. Connor kept his expression neutral. The man hesitated, then pulled a worn card from his pocket, setting it on the counter. If you hear anything, let me know. Then he turned and walked out. The bell jingled behind him. Jesse exhaled loudly, picking up the card, his brow furrowed as he read the name. Tucker Barnes. That mean anything to you? Connor didn't answer, but it did. And now he knew the hunter's name. Back at the cabin, Solana's ears flicked toward the door. She heard it. Footsteps in the snow. Slow. Calculated. Not Connor. Someone else. And they were getting closer. Connor's grip tightened around the wheel as his truck tore down the icy road. The name Tucker Barnes sent a warning through his gut. He didn't know the man, but he knew his kind. Ruthless. Entitled. Dangerous. The kind who saw wild Mustangs as dollar signs. And now Barnes was looking for Sal Anna and Rio. Connor clenched his jaw. Had Sal Anna stayed calm in his absence? Or had she panicked the moment he left? Something told him he needed to get back. Fast. He pressed harder on the gas. At the cabin, Solana's instinct screamed that something was wrong. The sound reached her ears, faint, deliberate steps on the snow. Not like Connor's. His had been steady, purposeful. These were different, careful, predatory. Her nostrils flared, muscles tensing despite her exhaustion. Rio remained curled near the fire, breathing steady but weak. He had made progress, but he was still fragile. Sal Anna shifted closer. She wouldn't let anything happen to her foal. Then, a shadow moved past the window, her ears pinned back. A deep, low breath pushed from her nostrils. She knew that shape. The scent hit her next. It was him, the man she had run from, the one who had chased her. Her heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she stayed. She stepped protectively over Rio, eyes locked on the door. Then a knock. A violent shiver ran through her. A pause. Another knock. Louder this time. Connor's truck skidded slightly as he pulled onto the snow-packed path. His breath hitched. A dark figure stood on his porch. Barnes. The bastard had found them. Connor killed the engine and stepped out. His boots crunched against the ice-packed ground. His rifle was still in the truck, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. No sudden moves. Barnes turned at the sound. His eyes narrowed. He stood tall, thick layers of winter clothing adding to his broad frame. His posture was stiff, controlled, calculated. Connor stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" His voice was flat, cold. Barnes smirked. "Might be able to." He gestured toward the cabin. "I'm looking for a Mustang. Big mare, dark coat, travels with a foal." Connor's stomach tightened. He held his expression. "Haven't seen one." Barnes chuckled. Slow, untrusting. "See, that's funny," he said, rubbing his gloved hands together. "Because I tracked her prints here. Led straight to your doorstep." Connor's pulse slowed. Barnes was testing him, pushing for a crack. "Tracks can be deceiving," Connor replied, his tone even. Barnes' eyes darkened. "That right." Neither man moved. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Barnes was reading him, waiting for a tell. Finally, the hunter exhaled sharply. He stepped back toward the porch railing. "All right then," he muttered, slapping the snow off his gloves. "If you see M, let me know." He turned, pausing only to glance back. "That mare's got a price on her head," Barnes added. "Someone's going to collect." Connor didn't flinch. He only watched as the man walked away. Connor's jaw tightened. Barnes took a slow step off the porch, pausing just long enough for his sharp gaze to flick toward the smallest of details. Hoofprints in the snow, leading around the back of the cabin. And just like that, his smirk returned. He glanced at Connor. "You take care now." Then he walked off. Connor didn't move until the sound of Barnes' truck faded into the distance. Inside, the moment the door shut behind him, Salana stomped her hooves. She was angry, afraid. Her muscles were tight, nostrils flared, instinct screaming danger. Connor set the supplies down, his pulse still racing. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. That was close. Salana didn't relax. She kept her eyes locked on the door, still listening, still ready to react. Connor crouched beside Rio, checking his pulse. Still weak, but better. At least there was that. Then, slowly, he turned to Salana. "Looks like we've got a problem." She snorted, ears flicking back. Connor's gaze hardened. "He's coming back." The air inside the cabin felt thick, tense. Salana stood rigid near the door, ears twitching at every creak in the wooden floor. She didn't trust the silence that followed Barnes' departure. Neither did Connor. Men like Barnes didn't just walk away. Connor sat beside Rio, keeping a hand on the foal's side, feeling the slow but steady rise and fall of his breath. He was growing stronger, but not fast enough. If Barnes returned, and Connor knew he would, they needed to be ready. Salana let out a deep, frustrated exhale, shifting her hooves against the wooden floor. Connor pushed himself to his feet. "I know, girl," he muttered. "I don't like it either." Moving toward the window, he was careful not to disturb the curtains too much. Outside, the snow-covered trees stood eerily still. No tracks, no sound. That didn't mean Barnes wasn't out there. Men like him knew how to wait, how to stalk. Connor exhaled slowly, fingers running through his hair. His instincts told him to run, to load Salana and Rio into the truck and get as far from here as possible. But there was nowhere to go. Barnes would be watching the roads. If Connor made a move now, he'd lead him straight to them. His eyes flicked back to Salana. She was strong, but still injured. Running wasn't an option. That left only one choice. They had to fight. 2 miles away, Barnes leaned against his truck, parked just at the edge of the tree line, watching, waiting. He knew the signs. That man had been lying. Barnes had spent years tracking animals, studying body language, reading when something was being hidden. Connor Hayes was hiding something, and Barnes knew exactly what. That Mustang was inside that cabin. He wasn't sure why Hayes was protecting her. Maybe he was just another fool who thought he could tame the wild. Didn't matter. She wasn't staying there. Barnes pulled out his rifle, checking the rounds. Then he glanced toward the darkening sky. He'd wait until nightfall. Then he'd take back what was his. Back at the cabin, Connor was already moving. He grabbed his rifle from where it rested by the door, checking the chamber. Fully loaded, Salana watched him closely. He met her eyes. "I don't know what you've been through," he said quietly, "but I know one thing: he's not taking you. Not tonight. Not ever." She snorted, muscles twitching. She understood. She was ready, too. Connor exhaled, gripping the rifle tighter. Tonight, they wouldn't run. Tonight, they'd stand their ground. The cabin was silent, but Connor knew better than to trust the quiet. Outside, the sun had dipped behind the mountains, casting deep shadows over the snow. The temperature had dropped sharply, the cold creeping through the wooden walls. But it wasn't the cold Connor was worried about. It was the man waiting in the dark. Tucker Barnes was out there. Connor could feel it. He stood by the window, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line. No movement, no sound, but Barnes wouldn't give up. He was a hunter, and tonight, his prey was inside this cabin. Behind him, Salana stomped a hoof. She was restless, tense. She could sense it, too, danger drawing closer. Connor glanced down at Rio. The foal was stronger than before, but still weak, still vulnerable. They couldn't afford to lose. Connor's grip tightened on the rifle. This sends tonight. Then a sound. A faint crunch of snow. Connor froze, pulse slowing, body tensing. Another step, and another. He's here. A shadow moved outside the window. Then a metallic click. Barnes was armed. Connor didn't hesitate. He reached for the lantern, snuffing the light, plunging the cabin into darkness. If Barnes wanted them, he'd have to come in blind. Salana snorted sharply, shifting her weight. "Easy," Connor whispered. "Stay with me." Then a loud bang. The cabin door shuddered violently. Rio let out a weak cry, pressing himself against his mother. Salana whipped around, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. Another bang. Harder this time. Barnes was trying to force his way in. Connor raised the rifle, heart pounding, eyes locked on the door. Then silence. The handle turned. Slowly, Connor pulled the trigger. The shot that changed everything. The gunshot ripped through the night. A yell. A cry of pain followed the gunshot. Then a heavy thud against the porch. Connor's breath came fast, ears ringing from the blast. He didn't hesitate, rifle still raised. He moved to the window, scanning the darkness. Barnes was on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You son of a..." Barnes cursed, voice strained. He tried to reach for his gun, but the metallic click of Connor cocking the rifle stopped him cold. "Try it," Connor growled. "See how that ends for you." Barnes froze. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees. Then, slowly, Barnes laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You really think this is over?" he spat. "You think one bullet's enough to stop me?" Connor stepped onto the porch, his aim steady. "I think the next one won't miss your head." Barnes' smirk faded. Connor's jaw tightened. "Get in your truck. Drive. And don't come back." Barnes glared at him, defiance flashing in his eyes. For a second, Connor thought he'd test his luck. Then, with a wince, he pushed himself to his feet, stumbling toward his truck. Blood dripped onto the snow, his breath heavy with rage. He yanked the door open, climbed inside, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life. Connor didn't lower the rifle until the taillights disappeared into the dark. Only then did he exhale. It was over. A new beginning. Turning back toward the cabin, he saw Salana still standing near Rio, her eyes locked on him. She had seen what happened. She had seen him protect them. Connor stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He set the rifle down, running a hand through his hair. Salana watched him. Then, slowly, she lowered her head. Connor stilled. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hesitation. It was acceptance. For the first time since she had arrived, she trusted him. She wasn't just surviving. She was safe. Connor let out a slow breath, glancing at Rio, who had curled up beneath his mother. They would be all right. For the first time in years, Connor wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, he had found something worth fighting for again. As the first rays of morning sunlight stretched over the snow-covered mountains, Connor stood outside the cabin watching. Salana and Rio were no longer just survivors. They were home. The mare stood tall, her dark coat gleaming under the golden light, her injury healing. Rio, now steadier on his legs, pranced clumsily beside her, full of life. Connor exhaled, leaning against the wooden railing. For so long, silence had been his only refuge, a barrier between him and the world he had turned away from. But this silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It wasn't lonely. He had spent years running from his past, shutting out the world, believing there was nothing left to fight for. But Salana and Rio had changed that. They had come to him as strangers. Now they were family. A smirk tugged at his lips as Rio kicked up a spray of snow, then ran back to his mother. Bold, spirited, a fighter. Just like her. Maybe, just maybe like him too. Connor glanced toward the mountains, at the vast open land stretching beyond them. He had no idea what the future held. But one thing was certain. No one was taking these Mustangs from him. Not now. Not ever.